Hello and welcome to episode 14 of my mostly stock career. Now I need to talk to you about something, and that is the continuity gap that's going to exist between this episode and the previous one, because I did a bunch of stuff, and then I did stuff wrong, and then things recorded wrong, and now we're here. So, to sum it down a decent bit, let's go to min-miss to start what exactly happened that you kind of missed, because I can talk over this pretty quickly. First off, we launched this thing. Well, let me select it again, we'll go to it. We launched a satellite into a polar min-miss orbit, which is this bit up here, so that we could scan for resources wherever min-miss is. It's over there. And then because it didn't actually have an antenna, as you can see we have two docking ports, I actually docked this second probe onto the first probe so that I could get access to the antenna that I stuck on it right there. There's the antenna. And then I was able to actually scan min-miss. So now we have min-miss nice and scanned for resources. And we discovered that our landing site, if we open up the resource tab, okay, there we go. Had to click on ore, apparently. But we found that our landing site is actually really good for ore. So we're definitely going to be putting a lander there. Now, the next thing is actually the min-miss refueler station, which is the base piece of the station we're going to be using. So it's got two very large empty fuel tanks because we're going to fill these up. And we're actually going to detach this engine once we are done. Once we no longer need to move this thing around. I still think I want to change the orbit inclination a little bit so it passes over our target a little bit better, but I do honestly think that it's pretty good the way it is. It doesn't need to be 100% perfect, but it is there. So we do have this station that we launched. And a final thing that we did was in the launch of those, the first of those two probes that we used to scan, we launched a second probe along with it, and that second probe should be on its way to Duna, if I remember correctly. Here it is. This probe was basically a test to see how much delta V it's going to cost me at Duna's current phase, meaning that because Kerbal is down here and Duna is over here, which is a little bit misaligned from, I think the optimal phase is actually if we wait a little while and Duna gets up here somewhere. I want to say that's the optimal phase, but this probe is heading into an encounter with Duna. It cost 1800 delta V, so if I bring 2000 delta V at the current phase, I should be safe, since I do think it's going to get more efficient as time goes on, because we're going to be going to Duna pretty soon. Once we create a large enough mission ship to do that and we refuel it at our min-miss station. Once, of course, we're done at our min-miss station. But yeah, that is everything that went down between this episode and the last episode. So just, that's the continuity gap, and we covered that in like 4 minutes, so I think that's okay. So, what are we going to do today? Well, I have missions apparently. Oh yes, we also rescued Alris Kerman, who was a pilot. I was kind of hoping for a scientist, which is why I took up the contract, because I wanted a second scientist to send out to Duna so we could have two to run a lab. But unfortunately, it wasn't a scientist, although we did get another pilot, which I guess isn't that bad. So we saved him, and I don't think I did any other contracts. I might have grabbed some strange ones. Science data from surface of min-miss. Build a station. Perform temperature scans. I don't think we'll ever end up doing that one. Is there any new ones to do? It doesn't appear as though there's any new ones to do. We should tell you what they were when it gave you the rescue mission. That would actually be really helpful if it said rescue Jemet Kerman, the scientist or something. Just gives you an idea on who you're really rescuing, because I rescued 3 engineers on one of these episodes and I didn't need them. So how about I plan something to do and we'll be back in a minute. So I've got an idea on what we're going to be doing, and that is rescuing some Kerbals. And what I mean by rescuing is we've had Jebediah stuck in orbit around the moon for quite some time, and I think it's about time that he actually comes home, so we can use him for our Duna mission.
However, it is not only Jebediah that we plan to rescue. We also want to rescue both Stelina and Valentina that are on the Minmus science vessel. And while we do that, we actually want to bring 2 new scientists that I had purchased so that we can continue our scientific research on Minmus, since we do have a lot of data in that science processor unit. But we also want to be able to bring Bob and Stelina to do the science when we go to Duna, because it's going to be a couple hundred there's going to be probably a total of 200 to 300 days of travel time just getting from Duna to Kerbal. So between those that amount of days, we're definitely going to want to bring some sort of science users so that basically we can use all the science. And I'm just listening to this VAB music in 4 times acceleration, and it's hilarious sounding. And it's also cutting out a lot, and it's loud and distracting, so I'll probably turn that down for the actual video. But what we're building here is a miner vessel. And what I mean by that is this thing is going to go to Minmus, or it's going to go to the moon, it's going to pick up Jebediah, then it's going to go to Minmus, and it's going to land, pick up both Valentina and Stelina, drop off our 2 scientists whose names I do not know right now, and they're going to continue the science. We're going to launch this top piece off to return our Kerbals home, and we're going to leave the miner down on Minmus to continue mining stuff so we can start putting some fuel in that station. Of course, it does take me a little while to decide where I want everything to go, so that's kind of why we're skipping through stuff. I decided to change up the probe design where I kind of put the probe core inside this service bay, because I do really like using the service bays because of this feature. You can just stick some batteries, the probe core, and pretty much everything that you need inside of one, and it kind of acts as a nice shell for an actual probe versus having to have a crew cabin. And I ultimately decide to take my ore tanks and put them sideways, and then stick the drills also on the sides of the tanks, just because they seem to go better there. And I try to get it so that the landing legs work and the fuel lines will work for the engines. I change up a couple of these features at launch because I decided I wanted more thrust-to-weight ratio in this stage, so I take bigger engines on the bottom, and that actually conflicts with something, which are the landing legs, which I didn't know landing legs would actually stop the collision mesh from an engine. Basically meaning that landing legs, if you fire an engine at them when they're deployed, or if you deploy them into an engine, then they will stop the engine's thrust. And I did not know that. Although that could be a really interesting mechanic, being able to limit an engine's thrust, possibly even an SRB's thrust, by simply letting a landing leg open up. So we'll see me actually compensate for that later. But for now, we just put our finishing touches on, which are solar panels, winglets, and we take the thing to the launch pad. Now, this design of rocket, since it has such a powerful engine on the bottom, I decided to not need engines on the second 2 tanks so I could spare the mass of them, and just use drop tanks, which gives you more delta V. However, it does reduce your thrust-to-weight ratio, so if you're happy with your thrust-to-weight ratio, as I was, which was like 2.16 I want to say, I'm probably totally making that number up, but I remember that number from something. So somewhere on my craft, one of the stages had 2.16 thrust-to-weight ratio, so that's where that number comes from. And although the 2 tanks did a little bit of explosions, nothing on the craft was actually damaged, and there's some very strange wobbling, but it doesn't affect us to the point where we have to abort the launch. And we eventually do make it up into orbit and start sending it off to Minmus. And by Minmus, I totally mean the moon, since we want to rescue Jebediah first. And if you're unfamiliar with this technique of rendezvousing from a flyby orbit, which you might be, or you might not be, depending if you've seen the last couple of videos. Actually, maybe not. I think I talked about this. We did 2 or 3 of these in the other video that I didn't actually keep up all 23 minutes and 17 seconds of it, because in that video I actually rambled on about Duna quite a lot, and how Ike was incredibly hard to land on, how it had a 0.8 gravity of Kerbin, that it was this big planet that you needed like 2,000 meters per second to orbit, and it was incredibly hard to land on. And that's Tylo. And I very confidently mistook that for Ike at the time. So there was about 10 to 15 minutes of that 23-minute video that I was rambling on about how you might land on Ike and Duna. And the whole time am actually imagining Tylo instead of Ike. So that's what I meant by I messed up some stuff. As well as I also messed up some recordings of actual docking things. But besides that, that's why there was kind of that continuity gap, because that's quite a lot of time spent saying the wrong thing, and I'm not trying to confuse people. But we do our flyby. We have to do it a little bit differently because the way our orbit, it's not aligned, and I couldn't use the normal and anti-normal vectors to actually align it very much better. So I just kind of go with what I had, and I employed the same idea where you slow down above your targeted orbit. Then of course you create your encounter on a different node, and then once you have your encounter, you burn to the encounter and of course match your velocities while you get to the encounter. So the flyby encounter thing, it works. It's more efficient the closer you can get it, the earlier. So if you can get an encounter flying straight from Kerbin into the moon just when you hit the flyby encounter of the target's orbit, if you can actually get the encounter right there, that is the most efficient. But typically that's not going to happen. So usually you do it kind of the way I've shown, and it's, like I said, the less steps you have to do, the more efficient it is, just because you don't have to use fuel to get an encounter, or you don't have to use fuel to set up an orbit that will get you an encounter. You can just use fuel to get the encounter. But as long as you're not flying around the moon constantly changing your plane severely, then you're being pretty efficient with it. So we have Jebediah here. Instead of getting really close, I want to conserve some fuel because I don't know if I'm going to have enough. So I take Jebediah out and I let him be the one that comes to me instead of actually matching these two, this rendezvous very much closer. Because I don't need to with Jebediah. He's got plenty of EVA propellant fuel, and I don't have to use the fuel in this lander in case I need it later. And as it turns out, I do end up using a lot of it later, but it's actually from the stage above it, even though it was kind of an unnecessary stage, how much fuel I brought above it. But yeah. So now that we're on the moon, we just have to play around a lot, and I mean a lot of playing around with maneuver nodes, and luckily video editing allows me to skip through until we get the successful one. And after somewhere around 4.5 minutes, I managed to come to a conclusion on what I wanted to try and do, which to start is just going to be an initial burn that pulls us or pushes us away from the moon. As you can see, we're in a new orbit now. And then there's a fix burn, just a redirect really, that fixes up our orbit so we end up encountering Minmus. And then once we do our little bit of a flyby, we do some orbital editing so that we will land at the target location. And then we begin to land at the target location. At this point, it's where I decide I'm going to take the fuel from my top stage because I don't have enough to actually land with. So I just take it out of the top stage because I think, oh, this is a mining vessel. It can just mine more ore and refuel itself. So there's no real issue of taking the fuel because I can always just put it back once I've refueled the thing. So of course we tried to land pretty close to our target. Even though it's not technically the most fuel efficient area, because a little bit more south was the fuel efficient area. This is actually kind of on the borderlands, so it's a little less efficient, which is why we'll be moving this thing later. But we just kind of use it as a reference on nearby where we want to land, since we do want to do our crew transfers. So we just slowly fall down on Minmus, and what you're going to see is the thing I was talking about earlier in the VAB, and that is I can't use my landing legs, and it's why I don't deploy them. Because if I deploy my landing legs, they actually block the engine's ability to fire out towards the ground, or they block the engine's ability to create thrust, since the thrust is fired out into space, and then that same thrust hits the landing leg, which just cancels itself out. So by canceling itself out, then we can't actually do anything. And I'm trying to figure out why it's so hard for me to land right now. like why I think I'm not moving very quickly and then I'm moving very fast, and that's because my nav ball is in orbit mode. So when you're actually trying to land, make sure you put the thing in surface mode. It will save you so much. And I actually figured that out, and it makes it so much easier to land. So I can land without need of the legs, and then just because I want to, I put the legs out, and they make my vessel do a little bit of a hop, but nothing that can't be fixed. And of course I deploy a solar panel so I don't run out of electric charge, and now we begin the crew transfers, where we take our first scientist, put her in, take Stelina out and bring her back, and we just kind of keep the process going for all the Kerbals we want to transfer. We grab our second scientist and bring her over, and then we will be grabbing Valentina to bring back, so that she can of course get some more experience as a pilot, and we can bring her to Duna, because we want to bring all 4 hero Kerbals to Duna. It's going to be a big mission, and they're all going to go there, and we're just going to have to rely on these secondary Kerbals to take care of Kerbin, the Moon, and Minmus while we're gone. So this is me testing the drill's speed. They're kind of slow. But I guess that's to be expected since I don't have any engineers. Since I believe engineers increase the speed of drilling, I'm going to bring some to this vessel later on, probably next episode, so we will be able to see if an engineer will speed up these drills. But I haven't tested it, so I'm not 100% sure, but I think that is the case. Anyhow, this is me just testing the drilling rate, the refueling, kind of making sure everything works out nice and well, and of course putting fuel back in my top stage. So that, of course, we can take the top stage and fire it off back to Kerbin. Now, just by doing some judgment calls on where we are, where we're angled, I kind of determined that it's going to be about 30 degrees east, which of course works quite well, getting our apoapsis nice and low on this craft, so we can return home. And since it's going to take about 9 days to actually do that, what I decide is to go back to my drill craft, yeah, it is a drill craft, but my miner vessel, and basically just kind of mine more ore, convert it, see how much fuel I can put in it so that I can move it to hopefully a more ore-rich area a little bit later on. Now we take a step back to our return vessel so we can bring our 3 Kerbals back. And of course, it's quite standard. Now I had way more fuel than I needed. I probably only needed 50 units, and I had 360. So, much more liquid fuel than I needed. I didn't even have to stage the thing for heat shield, because I didn't need one, because we really weren't moving that quickly. I had thought about saving this engine, which is why I still have it. I'd use my parachute and the engine to slow my velocity down enough to land with all of it intact, but I forgot the staging was off a little bit, so I ended up staging the bottom piece by accident, and it ended up hitting me. But we land the vessel safely without any damages anyhow. We just got back to our miner craft, and miner craft, kind of like Minecraft, but I suppose. Anyway, we're going to be moving it a little bit, because what we want to do with it is we want to give it a little bit more efficient mining area, because I think that this is too much on the border. If I actually go into the map view, I should be able to check this. If we double click on Minmus, we can focus it, and then we can bring up the ore, and then let's put in our 80% cutoff. So yeah, we kind of are on the edge, which means we're probably not reaping as much of the benefits as we could. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm just going to go south a little bit, and that should be fine. Now, this lander is a bit odd, which is why that I had to do 2 attempts to land it, because I did not anticipate the landing legs would actually stop these engines from working. I didn't realize, I knew other parts would stop engines from being able to provide thrust. I did not know landing legs did that. So when its landing legs are out, this thing actually has 0 thrust. So because they're out right now, if I actually thrust up, you'll notice we don't take off, because for some reason the landing legs are blocking the thrust, which means I have to do both takeoff and landing without the landing legs. And I really do wish that I could use my engines to slow down at this point, but they're not going to do anything.
So we're just gonna have to deal with the bounce and hope it doesn't throw us around. And this one was much nicer than the previous one, so did that. Let's see if the drilling is any better here than it was over at the other spot. And if it's not significantly better, then we'll just go and have to grab an engineer. So yeah, I think it's exactly the same. It's not significantly better at all. So it looks like we might have to grab an engineer to increase this thing's mining speed. Of course, we can just dock him on top of there. So we'll see what we want to do. Okay, so it's too far away now because it's 4.1 kilometers. So let's switch to our science vessel. I want to see how much science these two new scientists have been generating over the duration. So they do about 1 science every 9 days, roughly. Not the best speed. At least they'll keep it going until we can send in some more advanced guys, because I mean this thing has a ridiculous amount of data in it, and we can easily stick more data in it, so we can just keep refueling this thing full of science. But we wanted the veteran scientists so that they can do science while the Duna mission is traveling, basically. So while it's in transit between Kerbal and Duna, all of that kind of wasted time, we can at least have our scientists do some science, and we want them to be higher tier than level 1 scientists, so that they'll actually produce science rather quickly. So I have this contract here that wants me to get 500 units of ore from Minmus and put it in orbit of Kerbal. So to do that, let's just grab, I guess, a pretty small probe. So go with, oh, that one's not the one I wanted. Okay, so I don't believe I have the one I wanted. We can manage. We'll just grab this small probe here. We will proceed to grab a little bit of SAS so the thing can control itself. And we'll grab that small fuel tank. Because I believe that's 300 units, I need 500 units. So I actually need 2 of these small ore tanks, which is actually quite large, since we don't have the large ore tank unlocked just yet. And we'll grab the Terrier, because the Terrier is usually pretty efficient. And already we've got 4,200 units of Delta V, so this thing is good enough. Well, I don't know when it's full. Can I tweak these numbers? I can tweak these numbers. So let's say we fill this thing up. It's got 2,000 Delta V in it. So if we use this thing strictly for the landing and takeoff, it should be fine, because it's not going to use too much for landing on Minmus, as long as we do the transfer. And then it's still going to have a whole ton even when it's filled up to 500. Since we only need 500, we'll just assume we go over a little bit. And as long as we have a little bit of fuel left, we should be fine. Now, it is always a really good idea to check if you're going to be doing ore hauling to see what the ore tank, like how massive the vessel is when the ore tanks are filled, because it is a significant amount of Delta V, such as when my ore tanks are filled on this small craft here, I get half the Delta V I would have if they were empty, so to assume that I would get the same Delta V when they're empty or full isn't very good. If it's only like 2 or 3 of the small fuel tanks for a craft that's 100 tons, it probably doesn't really make that much of a difference. Maybe only 100 Delta V, not super a lot, but definitely if it's a smaller craft hauling a decent bit of ore, it will make quite the difference. So with this craft, it's quite simple. There are just 2 fuel tanks, or 2 ore tanks with 2 engines, and then kind of a launch stage, which I go through a couple different types to test. Of course, picking the one that works best for my situation. And then, of course, we actually try and launch the thing after putting all the struts we need on it. And I attach some tail fins kind of post actually doing that, because I always expect these things to have better control than they actually do when I don't add tail fins. So, we get this one going, we get it up into space, where of course we then tell it to go to Minmus because it wants to try and land on top of the miner craft
so that we can basically fill it up with ore and send it back to Kerbal. Now, because I actually encounter Minmus really high in an orbit, I both want to burn retrograde to slow my orbit down and radial in so I burn toward the planet. What that does is it forces my periapsis to go much closer to Minmus than it would if I had only done one of the two, either burning radial in or just burning periapsis. But by doing both, it puts my periapsis down towards the planet the most efficient. And here I am just deciding to try and do the closest targeted land I can, where I just keep my retrograde vector close to the horizon, directly aligned with my target, and then once of course I'm falling down towards my target, I make it so that my retrograde vector is completely aligned with the target, meaning I'm moving toward my target constantly. Now this landing, well, it's not really landing, I docked it without ever actually landing, but it's a very strange process because I was having an issue with how I was controlling this thing. Now, this was the original plan, to use the engines to keep myself above the ground, and then use the RCS to maneuver myself into a docking position. However, I had to actually disable the RCS and do this without it in order to actually get it to work properly. And the reason I had to do it this way was because when I used the engines close to the craft, when I was trying to use the RCS to dock myself, one engine would be very close to the craft I was trying to dock with, and one engine would be floating above Minmus, meaning one engine would actually give me more thrust than the other. And when that happened, basically my whole craft would tilt sideways. And when my whole craft was tilting sideways, or even just the slightest amount of tilting from this event, then what would happen is I wouldn't be able to keep using the RCS to control it, because by using my upward thrust I'd actually be moving sideways, which resulted in a lot of problems. So I just started using the engine to kind of try and drop into position, and eventually I did get it. And once my craft was refilled, I undocked it and sent it on its way back to Kerbal, so of course I could complete my contract. And since the craft had more fuel than necessary, I decided once it got down to its periapsis that what I was going to do was I was going to reduce its apoapsis as well, making it kind of a rather high yet below the moon and Minmus kind of orbit around Kerbal, so if I ever needed to, I could grab the ore on this vessel if I needed to. However, since I doubt that I would ever need to, I just am going to kind of leave it in orbit and see where it goes. Maybe I'll get rid of it someday, maybe I won't. Maybe it'll just kind of sit there as this ore-filled piece of debris. But we'll see. But on the final note, we grabbed one of our scientists out of their processing lab so that they could jump on Minmus's surface and grab us a surface sample to send back to the Kerbal Space Center. That way we can complete yet again one last contract, that is to give scientific data from the surface of Minmus, recover or transmit. That's what it is. So I just grab the experiment and I end up transmitting it back home to complete the contract, and that's where we're going to end for now. So I thank you all for watching. This is PTT JRW signing out.